an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I want you to think about this. Canadian forestry has a role to play in saving the planet.
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Welcome to this Story Studio Network podcast series. I'm Dave Trafford. In this series, Aaron Trafford and I will explore a number of ideas that hinge on the notion of Canadian forestry helping to save the world.
There's no path to a net zero carbon economy without the forest sector and forest products, full stop.
We'll talk about how and why Canadian forests have the ability to shift the climate crisis and the economy to build a better future.
There is no machine and no process known to man better than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
We'll explore innovations in forest management that drive a green economy and directly address the climate issue.
We have a significant amount of the world's forest land. With that privilege comes the responsibility of taking care of it.
So welcome in to this special series produced for Forestry for the Future.
We spent the past couple of episodes talking about changes and relationships when it comes to how we use forest and wood products. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to episode 6 yet, we talk all about the use of mass timber as a primary construction material in major infrastructure projects.
And it led us to this conversation about the place the forestry industry holds in our own history, in our economy. And we concluded that society's relationship with the forest is really at the heart of forestry's role in this fight we've been talking about against climate change. That the value of the forest, the value of the wood product itself, goes beyond the furniture or the musical instruments. And I'm not going to get off on my guitar tangent, I promise. But anyway, I should point out, remember we talked to Laird Van Dam in the last episode, right? And you and I were riffing on the idea that guitars can save the world because it's got all that. His vice are canoes. He says he owns a whole bunch of canoes, and he didn't quite say, the reason I'm doing it is because it saves the planet. But the point is, all of this stuff actually captures and holds the carbon for as long as we use it. So that includes the musical instruments, the books, the house you live in, and its value now heightened even further beyond the actual object because of the capacity to capture and store carbon.
So our changing relationship to wood and how we use it, our changing relationship with the forests, also providing momentum behind this effort to literally save the planet. This is what we've been talking about for the past few episodes. Better use of wood, more efficient use of the tree, more efficient manufacturing and building technologies all lend themselves to lower carbon emissions.
And through it all, we've talked about the ever-evolving science of forest management. And the most interesting thing to me is we've heard one forester after the other come to the conclusion that this new science increasingly reflects the cultural, historical knowledge and relationship our First Nations and Indigenous peoples have had with the forest for thousands of years.
So in this episode, we want to explore how some of those historical Indigenous cultural practices are being recognized as 21st century best practices.
I want you to meet JP Gladu. He served as president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business between September of 2012 and April of 2020. He and I actually crossed paths when I was doing some work for the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. But he's also the chair of Canada's Forest Trust and is currently the principal of Mokwateh.
Mokwateh has been around for a few years now, but I've been in the bush my entire life as a First Nation person with a forestry degree. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
We also connected with Albert Gerow.
My name is Albert Gerow. I'm currently the lead
advisor to Strategies 360 for British Columbia, and former chief of the Burns Lake Band.
Both JP and Albert bring an important perspective to the discussion today. Not only how forest management is being informed by First Nations and Indigenous knowledge, but where is the place now for First Nations in the process of managing our forests? JP says, at a very minimum, diversity in experience and point of view, like diversity in the ecosystem, is critical to any success.
Diversity is absolutely important to any conversation. And having, the original caretakers of these lands across this country at the table in co-managing or managing in some cases, like the Lake Nipigon Forest Management company here, that's 100% managed and owned by our First Nations. Yeah, absolutely. It brings in a different perspective, and it goes to, this is something I'm a big governance guy. I do a lot of governance work. I sit on corporate boards and Indigenous boards. I've had a lot of experience. And when we look at the shareholders of, say, a publicly traded company, you could be one, I could be one. We're looking at the reports every quarter, right? But if you look at an Indigenous corporation, a development corporation, or an Indigenous community, the shareholders are the community members. And the community members don't think in each quarter, they're thinking 7 generations. So our timelines are very different. And the way that we relate to our land and our waters around us is also reflective of that much longer time horizon in which we think about planning. My daughter and I, to kind of bring it down a generation, she's in college now, so she's not hunting with me this year, but she hunts and she fishes with me, and we're in the forest all the time, and she loves it, and it's such an important part of her culture, and I'm passing that down and I hope that she'll pass that knowledge down to the next generation. And I think it's just more acute in northern communities, not only just Indigenous communities, but people that live and grow up in the north, have a longer history. And I would argue, given that a lot of our society is shifting to the cities, we probably have a longer time horizon in our relationship moving forward. And that gives you a different perspective and different objectives in the way that we manage our forests and relate to them.
At what point, I understand the commerce connection here. I mean, that we talk about that sort of that stewardship that's involved in making sure that we keep things healthy and moving forward because it makes economic sense and it feeds people, etc. But where does that cross over to more of a spiritual part of the culture? Because it's hard to pull those two things apart, I would think.
Yes, that's a great question. Again, I think it's tied to history, and I think it's tied to your culture. And again, going back to my comment about, my history goes on this land since time immemorial. Whether you believe in the spiritual connectedness of this, because I certainly do, because I know it's in my cells. I know that even the past trauma of residential schools are in my cells, because whenever I have to deal with those issues, I feel it with every cell in my body. And I feel that connection when I'm out in the land, when I'm hunting. I did harvest my moose this year. I harvested fish from the clean water in which the forests are all around. And there's that connection that it's hard to explain. And I don't think you have to be Indigenous to have that strong spiritual connection to the land. I think you can develop that over your lifetime, or if you're a northern community and you've just grown up in and around it. It's I hear this term forest bathing. I kind of giggle a little bit with this idea of forest bathing, but I get it. Because I live a lot of my time in the cities, but as soon as I've been on the road for 10 days and I'm just home now. And even if I'm home for a couple days, I guess I'm bathing in the forest, but it's cleaning me and it makes me feel really good.
Part of that is really relying almost on a cultural and a spiritual connection with the forest. I mean, is there any other way to explain that?
Yeah, I don't know that there is. The forest is really our home. And, often, like I live in Victoria now, but I was born and raised in Burns Lake. And when I return to Burns Lake, one of my strongest desires is just to get back out on the land in the forest. And when you're out walking a trail in the forest, and you may hear the birds singing and what have you, nothing grounds you quicker than being out walking in the forest. You may find as you're walking a sense of renewed energy, and that's because when you're in a city, the oxygen levels may not be as high as if you're right in the dense forest, where the oxygen is actually being made. So that might be part of the reason why we're feeling better. But also, when I've done it myself and I've seen others do it, when you come upon a tree that's hundreds, if not thousands years old, how often have people gone up and just hugged that tree? You don't see people going up and hugging a cement building, but you will see them hug a tree, and they'll hold that just for a couple of moments, and it's almost like a spiritual thing where you begin to sense the energy of the tree, and really helps ground people.
And how do you put a value on that? I mean, because I think that's an important part of what we miss with such a concentration of our population now in urban centers. I'm in Toronto, in beautiful downtown Don Mills. The advantage I have is that I live on a very green stretch, and the city itself is very green. But I don't think we fully appreciate the value of it. And I don't mean in a well-being value. There's ROI here because I'm more productive, I'm healthier, and I hesitate to suggest that we need to put a dollar value on that, but there is a value.
There is for sure, and that's where we're beginning to see some of the growth in Aboriginal tourism, where you're seeing more and more businesses rise, where Indigenous peoples are taking anyone who is interested in learning more to take people up on some of those Aboriginal tourism initiatives, and sharing the knowledge from the land and what our ancestors have taught us, and those types of things. And those really, exactly. You're exactly right. How do you put a dollar value on that?
There is real value in that, even an ROI. That spiritual connection is both ancient and present.
And as you heard from both JP and Albert, you can't really separate that spiritual human connection with the forest from the way we manage forests.
Putting a value on that spiritual relationship is one thing, but JP, who's no stranger to Bay Street, says translating that value to the corporate culture is challenging.
It's been a massive challenge. My first job at a Sioux college was working for the First Nations forestry program through NRCan, and working with my community. And, we were relegated to small chunks of reserve land. We had very few opportunities in the regular crown forest, if you will. And, even in 2008, when our sector started to really suffer, and I was at the negotiating table on behalf of my community, along with 3 other First Nations against the forestry companies and the government, there was just such a pushback in anything that was Indigenous. We were successful in getting to management and control of 100% of the forest. But industry has pushed back for a long time because they could. They pushed back because they saw if we gained any kind of access to commercial opportunities that they would lose. And so the corporations in this country have pushed back and dug in for a very long time. So that's been the biggest challenge. But I would say, especially in the last 5-8 years or so, especially with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the hard work of Justice Sinclair and his friends and colleagues, and the recognition of the 215, Canada's woken up and went, in the world, quite frankly, and went, wow, this really happened. And so now it's at the dinner tables of everybody. So these corporate leaders go home to their wives or their husbands and their kids, and the kids are going, "What do you do, Mom? What do you do, Dad?" Really? They're getting pressure from their kids. They're getting pressure from every part of society. And what I found, I've worked with great corporations over the years. I've worked against some really terrible corporations over the years. The ones that get it and embrace it, they start to come to the table with a new appreciation that it's not a zero sum. They're not losing by incorporating Indigenous people and communities into their sectors. They're actually gaining, and they're building more opportunity and that diversity of thinking. And the whole ESG. There's an I in environment, social, and governance in the world is looking. We all gain when we incorporate more Indigenous people. So in recent past, it's become a lot more tangible as far as the positive relationships and the opportunities than ever before. And I'm seeing it in sectors that I would never even guessed would want to start to engaging our communities. So I'm excited. I'm excited for the future and my daughter's future.
As I listen to JP say that, the corporations that get it are those that come to the table with a view that incorporating Indigenous communities into their sectors, forestry or otherwise, are the ones who see value in that. It occurs to me our focus is subtly shifting from our relationship with the forest to the relationship between First Nations, business, and government right across Canada. Albert is actually seeing this unfold in British Columbia, where there are a significant number of Indigenous individuals who own and operate forestry-related businesses in that province.
There are a number of Indigenous communities that do hold forest licenses. In 2006, 2008, in that area, I was the Director of Operations for the BC First Nations Forest Council. And at that time, we had roughly 120 First Nation communities that had access to 14 million cubic meters of wood fiber. That included coastal fiber as well as interior fiber. The sad part about it at the time was that was when the downturn was in the housing industry in the United States in 2008, and a lot of Indigenous communities weren't able to move much fiber. That's improved some for sure since then, and we're making strides forward. A key thing to think about with respect to British Columbia too is that unlike the eastern provinces east of British Columbia, 95% of the province of British Columbia is unceded territories. This is First Nations land that has never been signed over or agreements made or turned over to the Crown. And so when you look to British Columbia and the Indigenous peoples whose traditional territories we're on, there's huge opportunity in reconciliation to be able to not give Indigenous peoples a handout, but a handout, and be able to make our impressions on the economy.
That's an important distinction, and I'm glad you brought it up because I don't think a lot of people realize that the territories in British Columbia are unceded, that they aren't necessarily covered by treaties, etc. So it brings up an interesting question around our approach to publicly owned forestry. I mean, we keep hearing that the Canadian model, it works so well because we, the Canadian public, pretty much own most of the forests. It's all on Crown land. How does that present itself in British Columbia when you've got, the Crown involved? Clearly, you've got the legislature in British Columbia providing regulation around forestry, forest management, etc. How does that relationship work with First Nations and British Columbia?
Well, there's a couple things that have been happening over the last few years. First off, I mentioned earlier about the legislation being passed as law, the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And each of the ministers in BC are tasked with looking at opportunities to be able to really show that the United UN Declaration is working for First Nations. And with that, it creates a real opportunity for First Nations to be able to step forward in forestry, for example. There's currently more and more Indigenous leaders are working with the Ministry of Forests to not only be where the Ministry of Forest makes a determination of the annual allowable cut, the First Nations are looking to having a say into how that annual allowable cut is determined in BC. And so, as opposed to a step-down process where the chief forester tells the Indigenous peoples and people in British Columbia how things are going to happen, more and more Indigenous leaders are wanting to be able to share in the decision-making right at that senior level.
And does that include who is licensed per se to go in and do the harvesting in terms of, having some, I guess, control over the actual commerce, the business of doing the harvesting?
I don't believe that we're at that point just yet, where they're actually, the Indigenous people are actually saying who gets a forest license or who doesn't. But I suspect as time goes on and we begin to have more and more opportunities to share in the decision making, that will come about.
So walk me through that decision making, that decision tree, for want of a better phrase, in the context of forestry. If we're talking about consulting with, and I would hope that means not just paying lip service to First Nations communities in this discussion around what's the allowable harvest, and if in fact we take the next step, as you suggest, and we get into this procurement discussion, and there is some level of decision making at the First Nations level, how does that decision look as opposed to how it's being presented now? What's the character of the First Nations input that changes the decision making, I would guess, for the better?
What's happening as we continue to move down that path is Indigenous leaders are sharing with those senior government officials, decision makers, a lot of our ancestral history and how we took care of the land. And so we begin looking at other things like, for example, cumulative effects. When a forest license might be issued, in often cases, in the different particular areas, if there's more than one license issue, are the cumulative effects of those multi-license being really assessed at that time? So that's an area where we can share some of our knowledge.
And where does that knowledge depart from the, we'll call it sort of the mainstream Western view of how we're doing it right now?
The way that differs is we, Indigenous peoples, we look back in our history. We look back 7 generations as to what's happened in over those years, and we look ahead 7 generations and what we anticipate we might be seeing in the future, whether it's population or communities or things of that nature, and how are those going to impact the land. And on top of that, how are we going to be able to plan to ensure that those future generations are looked after?
So that's a very traditional, and I say that in terms of the Indigenous approach. So 7 generations ago, they would have been looking 7 generations back and 7 generations forward.
That's correct.
Think of that. The First Nations looking back 7 generations and forward 7 generations. They take cumulative effects into account. It's this Indigenous version of the modeling that we heard foresters like Lacey Rose talk about in earlier episodes of this series.
Now, recognizing the wisdom of the Indigenous approach to forest management is one thing. Most would say, yeah, there's some merit to that. They're almost calling it scientific. But JP Gladu says so far, for the most part, we are still in a lip service stage.
When we think about traditional knowledge and knowledge holders, um, often, in the past, and I like to think we made some significant progress where the biologists and the geologists and all the ists will come and go, well, we can't really incorporate that knowledge system into our Western science. Well, that's pretty egotistical to think your knowledge system is better than ours on the land. What's important is to make sure that you incorporate the knowledge holders into the process, and that's every step of the way. So that's fundamentally important. And there's a whole movement now. I do a little bit of work chairing a group called the Boreal Leadership Champions. That's oil, gas, mining, forestry, finance, tourism. And, we're having meaningful conversations about what land back is and what that actually means. The thing that Canadians need to understand, and this is what sort of upsets me a little bit, is that Canadians think that we're opposed to resource development. No, we are opposed to the way that resource development got done in the past, where you came in, decimated our backyards, took everything out. We didn't benefit, and you left us with a mess. That's what we're opposed to. We're not opposed to figuring this out together. We're not opposed to developing our resources as long as we're at the table. We're benefiting, we're remediating, we're managing together with both knowledge systems. So there's the opportunity to do it together. And so I guess at the end of the day, we've got to shift the way that we do management together. Even within our circumstance here in the Lake Nipigon Forest, our 4 First Nations, we manage and control 100% of the forest, but we're still relegated to a tenure model that's Western focused, that you have to hit your annual allowable cuts, and you're going to harvest here, you're going to manage for this, you're going to manage for that. Well, maybe that's not necessarily the most appropriate way to go forward. Now, can we take a pause here? And, I know industry, and I'm a big supporter of the forest sector, needs to make sure that they've got ample wood supply. But, at the same time, our communities lived here since time immemorial. I need to make sure that I can go hunting in the bush with my daughter in a healthy ecosystem so that she can do the same with her kids. So one knowledge system isn't necessarily better than the other. And it's just about sitting down, understanding our values, figure out our values first before we get into management and operations and partnerships. Because if we can't align on our values, we're going to continue to have that conflict.
Well, it's a thoughtful and provocative way to end the conversation. JP Gladu, thanks for joining us. We appreciate your insights on this.
My pleasure.
Albert, thank you.
Thank you for your time and this opportunity.
Provocative indeed. So here's what we learned. One knowledge system, not necessarily better than the other. And we'd all be better off when we include values into our forest management. We know the value of our forests and wood products only increase because we better understand the carbon capture capabilities. And that's changed our relationship with the forest.
So we extend and heighten that value even further now when we realize the next relationship that needs change is the one between Indigenous communities and the corporations and the governments of Canada.
And I don't know about you, but I really think we're going to want to watch what's going to happen in British Columbia and what's going on there now. I mean, the idea that most of that province is unceded territory. And that, in and of itself, is an entirely different relationship between the Crown and the First Nations in BC. That may be where we see Indigenous experience and traditional approach to forest management integrated more and more into provincial plans.
I'm really glad that Albert brought that whole issue up of unceded territories, because most of us think of our relationship with government and Indigenous peoples as being based on treaties. There is no treaties. So the Indigenous people in those territories in British Columbia never gave up ownership of that land. It's the right time to be having this conversation. We hope you're enjoying the series. We'd like to know what you think. After hearing the series so far, are you coming around maybe to this idea that Canadian forestry can save the world? Leave us a comment wherever you listen to your podcasts.
For Dave Trafford, our producer Becky Coles, and the entire team at SSN, thanks for listening.
This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This
is SSN.